Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It is Thursday, January the 8th. President Trump's actions in Venezuela have caused a huge reaction around the world, and especially here in Alberta, where there are fears that a revitalized Venezuelan oil industry will displace Alberta exports to the U.S. Meanwhile, just before we sat down to record this interview, we learned of amazing developments with the U.S. intercepting a Russian-flagged tanker in the Atlantic waters north of Great Britain, with a Russian nuclear submarine looking on. Of course, we can assume that there's an American submarine watching all this as well. But the tensions that are building up around President Trump's actions of the last weekend seem to have amazing consequences, and we really don't know where it's all going to end. One thing we can be sure of is that the case for an additional export route for Alberta oil, always impressive, seems more urgent yet. But could we be worrying too much? With me today is Dr. Ron Wallace, who served on the old National Energy Board that the Liberals got rid of years ago. He's a professional ecologist with a long career in energy regulation. In fact, he put in a little time in Venezuela. We'll ask him about that in a minute. But Dr. Wallace, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It's great to be here.
Well, it's nice to see you again. Ron, I see Alberta Energies took a hit over the weekend. In fact, they substantially down this morning. So some people think there's a problem. What do you think? Are we in trouble here?
Well, I don't think anybody really knows right now. There's so much happening so quickly. One writer for the Western Standard has come out and said that what we're going through is a $17 trillion reset. And that's a very accurate summation of what's happening on the world. On these.
Well, when there's a reset, there's something that was and something that will be after it's reset.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
What is the reset? Well, there's a great deal of media attention, and there's an awful lot of information being thrown about, some of which is actually accurate. But let's just go back to the beginning.
That would be the Western Standard.
Well, presumably. But let's just go back to basics here. Canada exports about 4 million barrels to the U.S. every day. 70% of that goes to Midwest refineries. The rest of it goes to the American U.S. Gulf Coast refineries for heavy oil. And that was the market traditionally that was developed and built around Venezuelan oil. And, of course, about 880,000 barrels a day goes through Trans Mountain, meaning it's about 85% full. So the bulk of the Canadian exports of our oil is going to the United States. So anything that's going to change that market is going to have a knock-on effect in Canada. There's just no question about it. The question is, what is the knock-on effect? What do we know? Now, things are developing very, very quickly here. This morning there was an announcement that between 30 and 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil will be transported to the United States and refined at those Gulf Coast refineries. Now, what effect does that have on the Canadian export thing? That's a market function. I can't tell you what that is. And in fact, there are people out there like Richard Mason at the School of Public Policy who's been giving out very, very accurate numbers. It would be very useful to hear what he has to say about that dynamic that's happening.
Well, let me just stop you there for a second. If there are 50 million barrels of oil going into the Gulf Coast refineries coming from Venezuela, do they have spare capacity, or is that going to displace Alberta oil in the very near future?
Well, I don't know, but 50 million barrels is a lot of oil.
And how much? What do we produce here in Alberta? Is it 4 million a day?
It's about that number,
so it's really only 12.
Well, that's the number that's going to the United States.
That's only 12 days supply them.
That's right. So this is a very dynamic market. So let's talk about that Gulf Coast refinery. refinery system. The what's called the USGC, the United States Gulf Coast Refinery Complex, is probably one of the largest, most well-developed refinery systems in the world. It's required billions of dollars of investment for coking, desulfurization, and hydrocrackers. And it was built specifically around Venezuelan heavy sulfur crude. That refining complex imports about 40 million barrels of heavy crude a month. And what happened is that as Venezuelan production collapsed from 3 million down to about 1 million barrels a day, which was then hit with American sanctions. That stream of oil from Venezuela caused the USG refiners to scramble to replace that oil. And they replaced it with Alberta crude, which was coming in by pipeline and was very quickly adapted to their system. It was perfect for their needs, as a matter of fact. So here you have Canadian Cold Lake, the Mexican, Mayan, Brazilian heavy grades were being offered, but Canadians supplied 13.6 million barrels per month, which represented 34% of the largest single crude to those U.S. refiners. And as a result of that, Canadian Cold Lake and WCS differentials tightened, with the WTI discount narrowing from around $13 a barrel to down to $9 a barrel. So the sanctions that the Americans put in place had a tremendous positive effect on Canadian oil production and transport to the United States. 34% of that refinery.
So that's what's at risk here for us.
That's what's at risk. That's the number that
we don't actually know.
Well, we don't know. Well, we don't know because the market will function here. The refiners.
Do we know what we don't know?
No, I don't. I don't think we do.
Because when you look at the total situation and Mr. Trump's actions, you could say this is about drugs. He's certainly been very emphatic about blowing drug boats out of the water. I mean, you can't say he isn't taking that seriously.
Yeah.
It certainly could be for geopolitical aims to make life difficult for China. He's had a year of doing that in his second term. This would fit that profile.
Well,
or it could be about the oil, you know.
Well, I think it's about all of it, right? But there's two very significant things hanging over this at a geopolitical. So it's so complicated. There's a geopolitical aspect to this. There's a political, as you say, point out to it, and there's also a Canadian economic level. And right now, Canadian economic level is kind of the bottom of the triangle.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. There was once a proposal to build a pipeline to the coast from. Oh yes, you know what I'm going to say, don't you? Okay, we're talking about the Northern Gateway.
Yeah.
Am I correct in saying that was fully permitted, ready to move the bulldozers in?
Yeah.
And it was one of the first things that the new Liberal government headed by Justin Trudeau did was to cancel that project.
Yeah.
Where would we be today if we had built the Northern Gateway?
That's a really perceptive question. And it's one that has not been, I think, as thoroughly examined as it should in terms of what that cancellation has cost Canada. At one point, I remember one writer at the time that happened, and I was still at the National Energy Board at that point. The National Energy Board had fully accredited and approved that pipeline. It required a certificate from the federal cabinet. They denied it and they shut it down. The cost of that immediately to the proponent, which was Enbridge, was estimated in excess of $500 million. Fully approved, fully licensed. The real slam on, there was a writer at that time said that was the worst economic decision that was made in Canada's history. And of course, time has moved on. But now, if you look back at that development and you realize that, Trans Mountain went ahead, the initial estimates is that the Trans Mountain oil would be transported largely to California to the U.S. The shocking development is that much, much more than what was predicted. I think up numbers of up to as much as 30 to 50% is now flowing to Asia. And that shows you what could have been with Gateway. Now, if you look, and that's the brilliance of the question that you've asked. If you look now with the presence of hindsight to say, where would Canada be if we had allowed Gateway to proceed, and it would be up and running or very close to up and running? Suddenly, that oil that is at risk to China. Right now, China was importing about 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day. Mm-hmm. That's gone. Now, not only is there a geopolitical aspect to this, China has put billions of dollars into Venezuela to enhance the oil trade and ensure that 400,000 barrels a day would flow to them. That's gone. That would now be made up by Gateway. So this is an enormous blow to Canada because we have nothing there. And in fact, we're at least 5, 8, 10 years away now from replicating that. We can enhance the flow maybe by 20, 30% through the
Trans
Mountain pipeline. Yes. That would that will help offset that flow, but the cumulative disastrous impact on the Canadian balance of trade and in our economy from that single decision that was made by the Trudeau government is only just now becoming to be numerated. You can now calculate the damage that's caused. Now, that doesn't talk about the geopolitical damage, but when you use that as your starting point and you fast forward to today, you see a federal government that shut that down. Now you see a federal government that's saying they're going to expedite it and effectively rebuild it, but they're going to rebuild it and accelerate it with decarbonized oil. Well, here the federal government,
just in case people have forgotten what decarbonized oil is, could you just remind us?
Yeah, well, the famous the grand bargain that Premier Smith has enunciated is based on an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that says yes, we will look at building a pipeline to the British Columbia Northwest coast over the objections of Indigenous and certain premiers. We will accelerate that and take it to some sort of a port, which is yet undefined, with an application that is being formulated by Alberta, which will be submitted to the Major Projects Office to expedite this project. All of these, and wrapped around that pipeline is a requirement that the oil be decarbonized with a $16 billion Pathways decarbonization facility.
Which is pumping CO2 underground.
Pumping CO2, taking it out of that production stream, not a refining stream, a production stream, and putting it underground. It's not an EOR, an enhanced oil recovery. It's a simple, it's a cost off the top. You're just taking a carbon CO2 and putting it underground. Well, these are tremendous penalties that have been put on top of it. So look at the Canadian history of policy. You know, I've talked to many people and they say, you know, energy policy is boring. Well, here's energy policy. It's not so boring anymore.
Yes.
Because we're in the middle of a $17 trillion reset. The energy policy that dynamited Gateway, which the federal cabinet said, no, we're not going to build this. Thank goodness they went with Trans Mountain, or we would have no access to that right now. The cards started falling with that decision. So now we have a situation where we have a federal government that has turned around 180 degrees, saying they're now going to expedite this, but at tremendous penalties at the front end.
So those penalties make me doubt their sincerity.
Well,
Do you really think that this is going to be the shock that Mr. Carney needs?
Well, the difficult. Well, they've said that the federal government, on top of all this 180 reversal, we're suddenly in full panic mode to get alternative access outside of the United States. They've said there's two major conditions. One is you have to have an indigenous partnership, and the second is that you have to be able to decarbonize and do that oil. Well, the question is right now is that will the private sector come to the table with those kinds of preconditions on it? Is there a market? Is there a political capacity in Canada to actually bring this about? Because remember, you're talking 2 years before you even get to put pipe in the ground, assuming you've got an approval.
Bearing on that matter of is Mr. Carney sincere about this, I gather there's an oil glut at the moment.
Well,
to expedite the new pipeline so that we can offer our higher priced oil into a glut of lower priced oil, doesn't give me much confidence.
Well,
you see a pathway here?
Those
unintended.
Those are the questions that any private sector investor is going to be asking.
Yeah.
Is that if you have a $16 billion penalty at the front end before you can build a $20 to $30 billion highly controversial pipeline to get to market in 5 to 10 years to offset what may be happening in the Gulf. And we're not sure what that is because that's going to be driven by market forces.
Yeah.
Right now, the refineries will take the best priced oil that they can get, whether it's Canadian or whether it's Mexican or Venezuelan, and they will refine it and they will put it out into the U.S. market. What has happened here is that this is a phenomenal market intervention by the Trump administration. They are controlling the oil. Well, what has happened in Venezuela is that when the sanctions came in, and the Americans blockaded effectively the oil tankers, what happened is that their heavy oil production from their fields filled up all of their storage capacity. If you fill up your storage capacity, you've got to start shutting down heavy oil wells. When you shut those down, that's a very serious thing because it's very hard to get those things up and running again. Now, what Trump has done is he said, okay, we'll take the surplus off your hands for free. We will sell it to the world market. We will refine it with American refineries and American tankers and American transport systems. And then we will sell it to the market. Then we will put the money in American banks and then we'll dispense it to whomever we choose, presumably the Venezuelan people. Well, that solved the problem for the Venezuelans because now they don't have to shut down their producing fields, and their storage capacity will in fact be bled down so they can start to refill it. So at least they're keeping their system running. But the Americans are, this is a market intervention, the likes of which I don't think is in history.
Right. So the reset that we're talking about is from this situation. Trump is doing the reset. What does it look like in 6 months' time?
Well, that's another really, really good question. I don't think anybody knows right now. But I can tell you that what this is a gigantic wake-up call for the, I don't want to use an adjective here, but the Canadian energy policy.
Let's say the government of Canada.
Canadian energy policy
yes.
has led us to a gigantic wake-up call, where now we are.
What must we do?
Well, it's very simple. We've got to diversify our markets, and we've got to maintain our competitiveness. And the Prime Minister in Paris say that he's saying the right words. We've got to diversify markets. We've got to make Canadian oil competitive. Well, how do you make Canadian oil competitive when you shut down the pipelines? You're forcing decarbonization, which, by the way, it's not Canadian oil, which will be the only oil producers in the world that are forced to decarbonize their oil. while we bring international sourced oil into Eastern Canada for refining, which is a big source of CO2 when you're there's much more CO2 generated when you're refining than when you're producing. But with this conflict that we've got running, where now Venezuelan oil effectively can come into Montreal and New Brunswick, but Canadian oil has to be decarbonized. And it's not just Canadian oil that is the only oil in the world that's going to have to be decarbonized. It's Alberta oil.
Yes.
More specific.
Yes.
Well, how do you maintain Canadian market access and competitiveness when you have burdened it with the lack of pipeline approvals? You've opened up the Canadian market to international sources of supply, and then you have to decarbonize it.
Well, I mean, you've been very vocal on this for the last few months, Ron, and I actually think that your opinions are starting to make a difference where it needs to be heard. Certainly, they know who you are and what your point of view is. I guess the question remains a very simple one. We can't undo what Mr. Trudeau did, but we can certainly demand.
Well,
Mr. Carney.
Yeah, we'll see if Mr. Carney is capable of unwinding it with the conditions. Because remember, at the same time, his net zero philosophy of this government is moving ahead. They have significant legislation in place, which is aimed towards this net zero philosophy. And there's more legislation coming forward from Senator Galvez, which will set out restrictions to the financial industry to invest in the hydrocarbons. So you've got this incredibly complex series of, well, one could say they're contradictory policies. How do you make Canadian oil competitive and accelerate its market access and diversify our markets with this legislative regulatory burden that's been imposed upon it? Now, the Premier of Alberta has talked about this at some length, where she's signed this agreement, this grand bargain with this MOU, but at the same time she's saying, we have to be rational and we cannot continue down the road of economic self-destruction. So this is a very complex policy environment that we've got in Canada.
You think that's going to come back to haunt her?
Well,
she's got an election in 2027.
Well, I don't know.
I don't think there'll be a pipeline.
The question is, who in the private sector is going to step up and enter this competitive environment?
Yeah.
So
okay.
Trump
There's actually another question, Ron, that we're almost out of time. I do want you to respond to this. As we speak, there is a naval interception taking place in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
An American Coast Guard vessel, I believe, which sounds less militant, I guess, than the Navy, but U.S. Coast Guard vessel is intercepting a Russian flag tanker a couple of thousand miles from the American coast. It takes me back to our high school studies about the War of Jenkins' Ear and things like that.
Well, that's
do you in your sort of black moments fear that this is all going to get so out of hand that people are going to start shooting at each other?
Well, that's a geopolitical question, and it's very timely. And I don't know. We'll see about it. But there is an upside to this, and I don't want to.
Tell me the upside.
The upside is that this regime in Venezuela drove almost 8 million Venezuelans out of the country, and those 8 million Venezuelans were included top level petroleum engineers, marketers, and so on. The upside to that is many of those very, very competent people that I worked with with PDVSA in Venezuela back in the 80s were very, very capable people, and they came to Canada and they're working in the oil sands, and they are being they are speaking out more and more. People are seeking them out. Very, very, very capable.
What are they saying?
Well, they're saying it's going to take a long time to turn this around. Now, the fact that Trump has used and grabbed that oil that was in storage and is bringing that to market very quickly. That's a market blip, whether or not it's significant or not. But the point is that assuming that the geopolitical situation and the internal political situation in Venezuela can be stabilized, the least amount of time for a major return to Venezuela is 3 years, maybe as much as 5 to 10.
Okay. So there's hope. Dr. Wallace, thank you for coming in and laying all that out for us. And obviously, at the West End Standard, we are going to be staying right on top of this story as it develops. The implications for Alberta are huge, but so is it for the rest of the world. For the West End Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.